First and foremost, as Nigel mentioned, the whole board of NatWest has to be questioned, their integrity and their capability. This is a board of directors that allowed the bank to interpret its environmental, social governance policies in a manner which motivated the bank to cancel a legitimate fee-paying customer for the bank. How could that be possible? Secondly, it's a bank that presided over Alison Rose misbriefing the BBC over why Nigel's bank account had been closed. They had a chief executive in whom they professed complete confidence, who was actually lying to the public, to the BBC, and presumably to her colleagues. But there are a couple of other things I think that Nigel didn't touch on, which are really important to mention. The first is that Alison Rose actually isn't even a director of Coutts. Now, that might seem like a small point, but Coutts is an independent banking organization. It has its own board of directors. How is it that the chief executive of NatWest got proprietarial, private information about Coutts's customers when she wasn't even on the board? Legally, she's not entitled to have had that. So there's a complete breakdown in corporate governance, both at Coutts and at its parent company, NatWest. So the board of NatWest is in question, but also the board of directors of Coutts needs to answer questions. And a knock-on consequence of that, where you inescapably end up questioning, is the role of the Financial Conduct Authority in all of this. The FCA is the regulator for Coutts, and it's also the regulator for NatWest. How is it that the FCA stood by while Coutts and NatWest indulged in this false virtue signaling, wrapping themselves in a blanket of virtual moral correctitude and allowing themselves to use that as an excuse to cancel Nigel's bank account? How is it that the FCA stood back and allowed private information to flow from one banking regulated entity, being Coutts, to the parent company NatWest, which is a separate regulated entity? They were asleep on the job. So the other question, therefore, is for the regulator. What were they up to? And then the third question, of course, Eamon, is for the BBC. The BBC and Simon Jack would have known that GDPR legislation was being breached when that information was being provided to them. And the BBC took the information and they published it without question. So this, I'm afraid, Alison Rose's resignation, if people think that's the end of it, I'm afraid they are sadly mistaken. Yeah. As Nigel said, this is only just beginning.
Yeah, and Ben, I don't know if you've been able to see her resignation statement or whatever, but for me, reading it, it's a lot of sorry, but not really sorry. There's a lot of comfort being given from the NatWest board, who you think, and Nigel Farage thinks, should all resign anyway over this. But it is all so intertwined. The regulator, Coutts, NatWest as the parent company here as well. But it all begins about Alison Rose and her record with NatWest, which is really, what's that got to do with the price of eggs, really? Because this is about Nigel Farage, and it's not the end of it. I think what you're trying to say is that this is only the beginning. Other heads will roll, and there will be changes, whether the regulatory changes or not.
Absolutely. And Eamon, this is not a problem that's limited to NatWest and Coutts. This infects the entire regulated part of the UK's economy. Any entity which is regulated and is required to comply with environmental social governance provisions will be virtue signaling, wrapping themselves up in this false blanket of moral correctitude, judging people like Nigel Farage purely based on his political views, cancelling them. It doesn't just infect banks, it infects pension funds, insurance companies, and listed companies, and all people who do business with them. It's right across the British economy, and it needs to have a very bright light shone on it, and heads need to roll right across the economic landscape.